He was a man of silence and discipline. Richard Widmark never chased headlines or fame. He earned them. Behind his cold stare and deliberate movements was a man who valued integrity above everything else. But in his final years, he made a rare confession that stunned those who knew him. For decades, he kept his opinions private, yet before leaving this world, he finally admitted there were a few men in Hollywood he could never forgive. The journey of a quiet fighter. Richard Widmark's story began far from the glamour of Hollywood. He was born on December 26, 1914, in the tiny town of Sunrise, Minnesota. His father, Carl Henry Widmark, worked as a traveling salesman, and his mother, Ethel May, cared for Richard and his younger brother, Donald, who was born in 1918. The family moved constantly, from Minnesota to South Dakota, then finally settling in Princeton, Illinois, where Carl opened a small bakery called Henry's Bakery. The family lived in the modest apartment above the shop, trying to build a stable life after years of uncertainty. Even as a child, Richard felt drawn to stories. His Scottish grandmother introduced him to the world of cinema. She adored silent Western star Tom Mix, and when Richard was just 4 years old, she would take him to the theater several times a week. Those dark rooms filled with flickering images became his first classroom, and the cowboys on screen became his first heroes. At Princeton High School, Widmark excelled both in academics and sports. He was bright, charming, and unexpectedly popular, captain of the football team and class president. But at home, life was less stable. His parents separated when he was still a teenager, leaving his mother to raise the two boys alone. She encouraged Richard to pursue college, and with a scholarship, he attended Lake Forest College near Chicago, originally planning to become a lawyer. It was there, in 1933, that everything changed. Richard joined the drama club almost by accident, performing in a college play that revealed a hidden talent he hadn't known he possessed. His natural authority on stage caught attention, and soon he was invited to assist in the school's drama department after graduation. Around this time, he met Jean Hazelwood, another drama student with the same hunger for art. She would later become his wife and his lifelong anchor. Richard graduated in 1936, stayed 2 more years to teach acting and public speaking, then made a bold decision. In 1938, he left for New York City, chasing opportunity in radio, the medium that ruled the era. Jean followed soon after, enrolling at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. Together, they built humble beginnings out of rented rooms and endless auditions. By 1942, they were married in Jean's hometown of Evanston, Illinois, just months after the United States entered World War II. Widmark tried to enlist, but a perforated eardrum disqualified him. Instead, he entertained troops through radio plays and Broadway performances. Then tragedy struck the family. His brother Donald's plane was shot down over the Netherlands. Donald survived, but spent a year in a German prison camp. Though he returned home, his health deteriorated, plagued by headaches and partial paralysis, until his death in 1955 at only 37. That loss stayed with Richard forever. He rarely spoke of it, but friends noticed that something in him hardened after that year, the laugh that changed everything. In 1947, a phone call altered his destiny. 20th Century Fox executive Darryl F. Zanuck offered him the role of a psychopathic killer named Tommy Udo in Kiss of Death. Director Henry Hathaway protested, claiming Widmark looked too intelligent to be a believable criminal. But Zanuck insisted. Widmark accepted, mostly because the movie would be filmed in New York, close to home. He had no idea it would define his career. The first scene he ever shot became one of the most shocking in film history. Playing Udo, Widmark grinned maniacally as he pushed an old woman in a wheelchair down a flight of stairs. His chilling laugh echoed through theaters across America. It was disturbing, unforgettable, and unforgettable meant famous. Audiences were mesmerized by the cold energy radiating from this newcomer. Critics called him Hollywood's new menace. The role earned him an Oscar nomination and a Golden Globe for Most Promising Newcomer. Yet fame unsettled him. "I thought acting was easy," he joked years later. "I haven't won anything since." Beneath the humor, he meant it. He feared being typecast as the villain forever. Still, Fox signed him to a 7-year contract, and Widmark began churning out hit after hit. Yellow Sky, Roadhouse, and Panic in the Streets, directed by his old Broadway friend Elia Kazan. That same year, Widmark reluctantly took on No Way Out, playing a vicious racist opposite newcomer Sidney Poitier. The script made him uneasy, but the studio forced his hand. After every scene, he'd apologize to Poitier, saying, "Sid, you know this isn't me." Poitier later said Widmark was the first Hollywood star to ever invite him to dinner, an act that meant everything in a segregated industry. The two men remained lifelong friends. By the early 1950s, Widmark had become a symbol of intensity and authenticity, a man who worked with discipline and respect. But in a business filled with egos, he was beginning to notice the kind of behavior he couldn't stand. It wasn't just about bad manners. To Widmark, it was about disrespect for the craft itself. He didn't speak of it publicly then. That would come decades later, near the end of his life, when he finally admitted there were 5 actors whose attitudes had tested every ounce of his patience. Frank Sinatra and Marlon Brando, talent without discipline. By the late 1960s, Richard Widmark had seen enough of Hollywood's glitter to know its cost. He respected actors who treated the craft like a sacred responsibility, but he had no patience for arrogance or carelessness. The first man who deeply disappointed him was Frank Sinatra. In 1968, they worked together on The Detective, a dark police drama that was supposed to merge 2 professional worlds, Sinatra's effortless cool and Widmark's unflinching precision. But from the first day on set, Widmark sensed trouble. Sinatra arrived late, brushed off rehearsals, and demanded the crew shoot quickly so he could leave by evening. He rarely memorized lines, depending on charm and spontaneity to carry him through. To everyone else, it was typical Sinatra, charismatic, untouchable. To Widmark, it was sacrilege. He had built his reputation through preparation, focus, and respect for the written word. Sinatra, in his eyes, turned acting into a casual pastime. After one particularly careless take, Widmark muttered to a crew member, "He's all charisma, no commitment." For Widmark, acting wasn't just a job, it was an act of faith, something that demanded total devotion. He never confronted Sinatra publicly, but the tension between them was impossible to ignore. Years later, friends said Widmark still bristled when the singer's name was mentioned. The second name on his private blacklist was Marlon Brando, a man Widmark admired and resented in equal measure. Brando's arrival in the 1950s had revolutionized acting. His raw energy, his refusal to conform, his unpredictability, these things both fascinated and irritated Widmark. "Some actors need chaos to create," Widmark once said. "I prefer focus." Everyone who heard the line knew it was about Brando. They never worked together, but Widmark witnessed Brando's erratic behavior across sets and studios. He'd heard stories of directors begging Brando to memorize his dialogue, of crew members waiting hours while he improvised lines no one else could follow. To the younger generation, Brando was a genius. To Widmark, he was a warning. Talent meant nothing without discipline. Widmark wasn't jealous, he was disappointed. He saw in Brando a mirror of what Hollywood had become, brilliance corrupted by self-indulgence. He once told a friend, "Genius is no excuse for laziness. You owe something to the story, to the people watching." It wasn't hatred born of rivalry, but of disillusionment. Widmark had come from a generation that treated art as a duty. Brando represented the new wave that treated it as rebellion. That divide, more than any personal feud, was what made Widmark's blood run cold. By the 1960s, his disappointment had hardened into conviction. There were certain names he could never forgive, not for what they did to him, but for what they did to the craft he loved. And soon, two more would join that list: Tony Curtis and Robert Mitchum, style over substance. By the mid-1960s, Richard Widmark's patience for vanity had run out. He had worked with the best directors, shared screens with legends, and earned the respect of audiences who valued authenticity. But then came a collaboration that tested everything he believed in. In 1964, during the filming of The Long Ships, Widmark found himself opposite Tony Curtis, Hollywood's golden boy, adored for his looks and charm. From the very first rehearsal, Widmark sensed the imbalance. Curtis arrived each morning impeccably dressed, every hair in place, yet his script pages were untouched. Widmark came from a world where actors showed up prepared, lines memorized, emotions ready. Curtis, however, treated the set like a photo shoot. He spent long hours in the makeup chair, fussing over lighting and camera angles. He was more interested in how he looked than what he said, one crew member recalled. For Widmark, who treated acting as a battlefield of truth, this behavior was unbearable. The tension between the two men became obvious. Scenes that should have crackled with chemistry turned stiff and cold. To outsiders, it looked like a clash of personalities. But for Widmark, it was something deeper. He despised pretense, the idea that image mattered more than honesty. Curtis symbolized everything that was going wrong with the industry: an obsession with glamour over grit, attention over art. "He doesn't play a character," Widmark once told a friend in private. "He plays Tony Curtis." If Curtis tested his patience, Robert Mitchum nearly broke it. Mitchum was famous for his effortless cool, that half-smile and sleepy drawl that made him a Hollywood icon. But off-screen, his indifference infuriated Widmark. Mitchum openly bragged about how little he prepared. "I just show up, hit my mark, and say the lines," he once said. To Widmark, such words were an insult to every serious actor who sweated over a role. Their philosophies couldn't have been more different. Widmark believed in discipline. Mitchum believed in instinct. When asked about him years later, Widmark sighed. "You don't stumble into greatness. You earn it." To him, Mitchum's casual approach wasn't charm. It was betrayal. And yet, the most painful disappointment was still to come. Kirk Douglas. The hurricane he couldn't forgive. If there was one man who stirred both admiration and anger in Richard Widmark, it was Kirk Douglas. They were cut from similar cloth, intense, commanding, and fiercely proud of their craft. Yet when two storms share the same sky, one must yield, and neither of them would. Widmark respected Douglas's dedication but detested his relentless need to dominate every frame. On set, Douglas's booming voice and theatrical gestures consumed the air around him. He wasn't satisfied until every glance, every line, revolved around him. Widmark, who valued quiet precision, found that unbearable. To him, acting was an exchange, not a competition. Douglas turned it into a contest of volume and ego. Rumor spread that Widmark once refused a lucrative role opposite Douglas, telling a producer, "There's only room for one storm in a scene, and Kirk brings the whole hurricane." It wasn't bitterness, it was fatigue. He had spent decades surrounded by men who mistook arrogance for strength. Widmark wanted dignity, not dominance. Their uneasy coexistence continued through the 1960s when they appeared together in The Way West. On camera, they were professionals. Off camera, silence. Widmark finished the film, went home, and never spoke of Douglas again. For him, it was a line quietly drawn, not out of hate, but exhaustion. By the 1970s, Widmark's priorities shifted. He chose roles sparingly, preferring his peaceful ranch in Connecticut to the chaos of studio lots. He had lost his brother, his mother, and soon the old Hollywood he once believed in. When he finally opened up about the men he could never forgive, Sinatra, Brando, Curtis, Mitchum, and Douglas. His words carried no venom. They were confessions from a man who had spent a lifetime holding others and himself to impossible standards. To Widmark, acting was sacred, a covenant between truth and discipline. Those who broke that covenant wounded him more deeply than any personal betrayal could. And as he grew older, he understood that the real tragedy wasn't that he disliked them, but that Hollywood had stopped producing men who cared as much as he did. The quiet exit of a man who refused to bend. By the late 1980s, Richard Widmark no longer belonged to the Hollywood he'd helped define. The parties had grown louder, the stars more self-absorbed, the films less honest. He often said that making movies had become an irritation rather than a joy. "I've only got a few years left," he told a reporter in 1987, "and I don't want to spend 12 hours a day on a set to get 2 minutes on screen." He wasn't bitter, just tired. He had given half a century to the craft, appearing in more than 70 films, from Kiss of Death to Judgment at Nuremberg and How the West Was Won. Each role carried his mark: restraint, discipline, and truth. Yet the man who had terrified audiences as Tommy Udo was, in private, gentle and almost shy. He loved quiet mornings on his Connecticut ranch, his wife Jean Hazelwood's laughter, and the rhythm of ordinary life far from studio politics. In 1990, his old friend Sidney Poitier presented him with the D.W. Griffith Lifetime Achievement Award. When Widmark thanked him, Poitier replied, "For you, Dick, I would have walked." It was one of the last public moments that truly moved him. That same year, tragedy returned. Jean was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's. From that day on, Richard became not an actor, but a caretaker. He turned down films, canceled interviews, and stayed by her side through every decline. When she passed away in March 1997, after 55 years of marriage, he quietly sold their ranch. "Without her," he said simply, "it isn't home." 2 years later, at 84, he married family friend Susan Blanchard, finding a small measure of peace in companionship. Honors kept coming. His induction into the National Cowboy Hall of Fame in 2002, tributes from younger actors who saw him as the last gentleman of the Golden Age, but his health began to fail. On March 24, 2008, at 93, Richard Widmark passed away in Roxbury, Connecticut. There was no spectacle, no scandal, no final interview, only silence, exactly as he wanted. To the world, he was the man with the sinister laugh. To those who knew him, he was a craftsman who lived by principle and died by it. His grudges were never about ego. They were about respect. For the story, for the truth, for the audience. Richard Widmark's legacy reminds us that talent means little without discipline, and that silence can speak louder than fame. Which of the 5 actors do you think clashed with his values the most? Share your thoughts below, and if you love stories of old Hollywood legends, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for the next untold chapter.